Welcome, Wargamers, to the Dystopian Age as we explore the lore behind Dystopian Wars, a fascinating wargame based in the same fictional universe as Wild West Exodus, which I've covered here on the channel before. Now, the links to that playlist where I go into more detail about the setting are down below, but in short, this is an alternate history world where alien technology and fuel sources derived from it were discovered in the early 1800s, and how that discovery dramatically changed the social, political, and technological evolution of mankind. Known collectively, all this change, this alternate world, is called the Dystopian Age. And it sees this timeline where well-known historical figures and events from our world are intermixed with sci-fi, body horror, cosmic horror, mad scientists, and more. It's incredibly cool. Now, that playlist down below for Wild West Exodus really focuses more on the United States and all of its alternate history, but the discovery and sharing of this alien technology and the power that it gave humanity simply could not be contained to the US. This was an event with truly global ramifications, and that's where the game Dystopian Wars comes in. See, breaking away from the Wild West of the United States, this is a naval combat game meant to represent the massive nation states that existed long ago, and how they had to change and evolve to meet this new step in human evolution. And today we're talking about the Imperium, or sometimes called the Prussian Imperium, the iron heart of Europe and the seat to some of the world's greatest minds. The story of the Imperium begins as far back as the 800s, with the crowning of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III. He went on to unite most of Western Europe, gaining the moniker the Father of Europe. And all of that happened in our world as well. But understand that this is the seeds of a united Europe, in this case, united religiously. And that's going to become extremely important because we're going to yada yada a tiny bit of history and move from the 1800s closer to the current timeline of the game towards the 1800s. But understand that in that 1,000-year gap, the initial empire was assaulted, expanded, contracted. The relationship of kings and their people and their neighbors is no less complicated in dystopian wars than it is in real life. An odd form of natural selection happened to this little European empire, where individual city-states would rise and fall in power until the aristocratic court of nobility that we know formed. But like I said, this wasn't a time of peace, right? The lands of Italy to the south were contested constantly. The greedy eyes of German and Austrian leaders were set on the Kingdom of France, and the advances of their armies were pushed back every time. In fact, as we reach the current timeline, this loose affiliation of nations that formed the Imperium nearly crumbled and fell into civil war over a decisive defeat at the hands of the French. This is why, in 1806, a new king was elected, the first Kaiser of the modern Imperium. His name was Otto Henrik. And this is where our timeline really diverges, as rumors of great weapons and power start to circulate around the world. See, Heinrich's first task was to solidify his borders and his military power. I mentioned before that the reason I brought up the thing in the 1800s, because it was the religious implications that the Pope Leo brought into the situation where it's kind of solidifying the church and state into one organization. Well, here, Heinrich is able to stabilize the region of the Imperium into a few main powers: Austria, Prussia, Bavaria, and Scandinavia. And understand, I'm talking about these empires in their prime. So the Imperium as a whole looks something a bit like this. It's a massive chunk of the world and its population centers. No more fiefdoms or kings. There are now a centralized government based largely in Berlin that oversaw the military and social might of the Imperium. And while this did cement Heinrich as an almost mythical figure in the Imperium's history, he nearly lost it all when he tried to invade Russia. You see, when Heinrich cemented his power, he had the goal of stopping this war on all fronts, right? Italy, France, revolts in Scandinavia, and of course, Russia. So he came in and made peace deals with France and Italy, and Scandinavia subjugated themselves and kind of became a protectorate of sorts, and this allowed him to fully focus his efforts on Russia. Now, at this point, the lore goes into some hyper detail, and I'm sure if you are a fan of World War I or European history, you'll love this. But frankly, these are the kinds of videos that go into, like, they don't quite go into that much detail. So here's the prime information that you really need to know. The assault of the Imperium on Russia was an absolute disaster. Little to no ground was gained, so many resources were spent, and ultimately, Kaiser Henrik committed suicide rather than face the shame of defeat. He solidified the power of the Imperium, but when he failed at using it as a single conquering force, he personally just fell apart. Now, luckily, he had instituted a few governmental systems before his demise. Firstly, he established the Diet, an elected governmental body of sorts that acts like a House of Representatives, built and chosen from the various provinces of the kingdom. They could create policy and give input to the governance, but they lacked any real legislative power. This was an organization that was meant to let people be heard and feel a sense of control. But understand this, there are no political parties within the Imperium. Any measure of democracy is meant to placate the masses. This is an autocracy, with the Kaiser at the helm. Along with the Diet is the Senate, and this is where some real political power comes into play, as these are the heirs and leaders of these nations, not so much elected, but granted this legislative power through sheer industrial and monetary might. For example, one important block of the Senate is the industry set. These are the owners and barons of massive coal, steel, and railway reserves. These are the power players, and as such are allowed to make policy at the Kaiser's request. So, for example, the boss gives an order. He's like, hey, we're going to go to war with Russia. The Senate will institute his wartime policies, put out the draft, resource allotments, rationings, and so on, while the Diet exists to manipulate public support into all of it. And all of this politicking and government rulership can seem like a far and distant thing for these citizens, except for one very important governmental branch that I haven't mentioned yet: the Teutonic Knights. Largely named and based on the historical knights of the old days, they serve as the executive arm of the Kaiser among his people. See, a commoner of the Imperium may go their entire lives without seeing a senator or an elected official or Kaiser, Kaiser himself, but they've all seen the Knights, who have a branch or fortification set up in nearly every cultural and political center of the Imperium. It's they who keep order. They enforce the will of the Kaiser and act as his personal militant order. It's like a second layer of executive power, and what's more, this is the kind of the thing when people talk about black ops budgets and conspiracies in the US today. The organization is a place where the Kaiser can funnel funds and research power to create some of the most truly horrific weapons and propaganda machines that the Imperium wields like a sword. So they are heavily armed and with some of the best weapons, German engineering, and the power to act largely separate from the state but under the orders of the Kaiser directly. The current Kaiser of the Imperium is Kaiser Friedrich, though much of his administration is handled by an advisor named Otto von Bismarck, which is a name that history buffs will immediately recognize. And to be honest, when you're playing Dystopian Wars, which is a naval combat game that's supposed to represent these nation states going to war, it really is the research and the funding of these Teutonic Knights that basically are what the truly devastating Imperium ships are made from. So as I do with all my videos, let's pause for a second and just ask the question, why is this cool, right? Why is the Imperium a cool faction in Dystopian Wars? Well, for one, it's a consolidated power base that needs to be refreshed over and over again. We're going to see as we touch on some of the other factions in this game that essentially a lot of them have solidified power more, but these are very specific regions. We went over, it's like Scandinavia, Bavaria, Prussia, the Prussian Empire, that kind of stuff, and also has this entire religious element that it's built on top of that sort of acted as its base. But more so than any of the other factions in this game, they rely heavily on propaganda and reinventing themselves, at least to to make the people think that they're always on the up and up and we're always succeeding and moving forward, but actually it's the same power bases over and over again. it plays on the strengths of the actual things that it has in its geography, right? Because historically, when we talk about, World War I Germany, that kind of stuff, incredible railway systems, which mattered immensely when it comes to how war can be conducted on a massive scale. They also have large mineral deposits across their entire empire, and there's a bit of political instability as a lot of these people groups really just don't get along, right? So the Kaiser is trying to wrangle a whole bunch of people who don't necessarily want to work together. And they also mixed in the power of the church and state early on in their government, and that's why the Holy Roman Empire is pointed out. I mentioned it at the very top of, it was important to note that the Pope named Charlemagne the father of Europe, because that's essentially how they found their power base. What unites all these countries? Their religion. It's a consolidation of control, influence, and power that mixed religious values with a united state that could act with one true authority. As I said, I just want to highlight one of the most subtle technologies to come out of this region, but also powerful, is the idea of propaganda. That you can get your people to be so excited about whatever it is, whether it's war, usually in this case for our purposes of our games, that kind of stuff, that it just solidifies them and galvanizes them in just an intense way. And so that's the weapon that they have truly learned to wield here in the Imperium. So friends, let me know your thoughts. Have you tried Dystopian Wars? Again, a few videos this week we're going to be talking about it because the good folks at Warcradle sponsored the content for this week. So we're going to chat about them quite a bit. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you in my next video.